Okay.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Saturday, May 26th. This is I'm Joe Jennings speaking here in Houston, Texas. Long-term ally of Lyndon LaRouche and its international movement. And I'm going to be speaking today on something that should be on everyone's mind as we're looking at this cauldron that's been heated up in Palestine and Israel in the wake of President Trump's moving the embassy over there to Jerusalem. And that is the title of my presentation today: is Israel-Palestine. Is it a spark for world war or a hub for world development? And that's a question that we have to answer. That's our task here. But before I go into that, let's take a look at some of the other stuff going on in the world. Go ahead, Mike. Yes, please.
Okay. Sorry.
Let's start at the top. When this is truly delightful, that the week started with the successful launch by the nation of China of a satellite they deem Magpie Bridge off of an old Chinese legend. But this is a satellite that's going to be going into stationary orbit around the moon. And I personally am holding my breath that this is successful, because if it is, then it will be followed by a lander on the moon by China on the far side of the moon, which has never been ever touched by human presence. And the purpose of this satellite will be to relay images from the rover on the far side of the moon, because on the far side of the moon you can't get radio signals from Earth, so there's no talk radio up there, no CNN, no MSNBC. So this will be the relay satellite. And the point is, on the far side of the moon, we're going to get an image of the universe that's never been seen before, uninterrupted by the radio distortion from planet Earth. And this just has to be a reminder to us that there is a big universe out there that we still have yet to discover as we work our way through these mundane problems down here. So what else has happened? Well, we thought the Korea summit was on, then it was off, and now maybe it's on again. And there's a lot of conversations that we don't know about. You know, North Korea and China, North Korea and Russia, South Korea and Japan. I think the U.S. has to develop a certain amount of humility, that we can't just bark orders on nations to disarm when we've got such an awful record of what's happened when the other nations took that advice, like Libya and Iraq. But as things stand right now, President Trump says the door is still open for dialogue, and we're very hopeful about that. And so there was an initiative that was launched by some friends of ours in Russia, a man named Lozansky, who heads the American University in Moscow, a petition which everyone listening can access on the whitehouse.gov website, calling for an early meeting between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. And this is extremely important. Everything you've suffered through since the election and even before the election, the hysteria about Putin hacking, Skripal poisoning, all the anti-Russian hysteria, which unfortunately a lot of Democrats have dropped any sense of sanity on this, but it's been aimed to thwart what is just a very good and natural thing, that the two largest nuclear-armed superpowers in the world should be in conversation. But really astounded me with this ad is this statue, which you see before you, which is quite amazing. This statue, I believe, stands in Moscow. And on the left is Abraham Lincoln. On the right is his ally during the Civil War, Tsar Alexander. And on the top of that pillar, which you can't see, is a boat. And what's the significance of this? During the Civil War, when the British were arming the Confederacy, supporting the Confederacy, had plans to, with Mexico, with the Habsburgs down and Bourbons down there in Mexico to invade from the south. The only ally that Lincoln had in Europe was Russia, which deployed its Pacific Fleet to dock in San Francisco, its Atlantic Fleet to dock in New York City, to tell the British, keep the hell out. So there you see President Lincoln and Tsar Alexander shaking hands, and of course one of the happy results of this friendship was the acquisition of the state of Alaska, which was sold by our friends in Russia to the U.S. After the war ended, even though President Lincoln had then been assassinated. But that has to be our task, that we've got to create the conditions where President Trump can have a man-to-man discussion with Putin on counterterrorism, on space, and the higher missions of mankind, because the British elites, their system, the days of that system of free trade, globalization, what Bush liked to call the New World Order, are numbered. And this was nowhere more evident than what happened in Italy. Now, talk about the power of one. The LaRouche movement in Italy consists of one person, a very wonderful lady named Liliana Celani, Guarini, yes. But she has, over the years, brought legislators to the United States, passed resolutions in the parliament there for Glass-Steagall, for bank separation. And the disgust in Italy is so deep at the Euro dictatorship, the choke grip they've had over their nation, that there was a revolt in the elections, kind of like the revolt that elected Donald Trump here. And this brought together what you would term a moderate right but fringe party called the Lega, with a kind of a moderate populist liberal called Five Star. And they came together in coalition, and they both support Glass-Steagall, and they both support, in some fashion, breaking with the euro. And the freak out at this prospect has been all over Europe. You think they're secure? Just the threat of one nation breaking with the euro choke grip. And of course, behind that fear is the fear of LaRouche and LaRouche's ideas that permeate, well, then if you break with the euro, then what next? One of our old enemies croaked. Bernard Lewis. Bernard Lewis died, went to his eternal reward at age of 101. This fellow has been a British operative in U.S. intelligence services for too darn long. He was the key proponent of the idea of how you can use Islamic fundamentalism to encircle Russia. They called it the Arc of Crisis, the clash of civilizations, that you inevitably had to have a war of religions. So in a certain way, he's the godfather of what happened with September 11th and everything that followed from that. But of course, he's now gone. So long, Bernard. But of course, all these things happen. But what was really the big news of this week, if you turned on your TV set? What was it, guys? There you go. Look at that. Now, this isn't a picture of the wedding, but it is a picture of these families, right? And be honest, how many people out there in the internet land spent some time oohing and eyeing over the royal wedding? They look almost human, don't they? But but what would George Washington say, right? If this, 200 some years after the American Revolution, people are oohing and eyeing over a degenerate oligarchy that has no positive reason for existence, that establish themselves above the mankind based on bloodlines and wealth and privilege and no merit at all. But of course, we're told, well, they have no power. We can fantasize a little bit, can't we? It's like a fairy tale, right? Well, we're also going to talk about that a little bit today also. Okay. So anyway, we are going to zero in on Israel-Palestine, right? Which is called, that area of the world is typically called the Middle East or the Mideast, right? Now you look at this big old map here, of Eurasia and Africa, right? Where is Israel-Palestine and all that, huh? Right? It's on the far east side of the Mediterranean, yes, but the population centers, if you have India and China, and then you bring in Japan and Bangladesh and Korea, you've got well over half the population of the world, right, in population centers. And it's the only way you could call up Israel-Palestine the Middle East is if you somehow think that Britain is the center of the universe, because they're the ones that gave that designation. So no, we're actually talking about Southwest Asia, and the solution for that area, I believe, is having Israel-Palestine and environs joining, participating, embracing the positive developments coming out of Eurasia. But you know what? That's also the solutions to the problems we face here in the United States. So here we are. This is, as I say, the Middle East. We've had some classes before about Sykes-Picot. You look at these funny lines that divide the territories. They're somewhat insane. How did the little nation of Djibouti come into existence? Saudi Arabia is there as a big mass, but no sea coast on the bottom. Well, this was all done by the British in terms of what's called geopolitics. How do you keep, the peons fighting each other over race, religion, ethnicity, and to control the resources and the wealth. But there's no area of the world that's more defined by that than what we're talking about today here. And this is a picture of what we're talking to. Now you see, of course, Tel Aviv there. That has been the traditional legislative capital of Israel since the founding of Israel in 1948. It's a modern city. President Trump was induced to move it to the historic religious capital of Jerusalem, which is also, of course, sacred to the Muslim religion as well as Christianity. And with a predictable flare-up. But then you look down there in the lower corner, right? That green strip is called, they call it the Gaza Strip. It's about 1/5 the size of Houston. And yet you have close to 2 million people living there in this one little strip without the physical infrastructure in terms of water and sanitation and food that one would require. And then you have the West Bank, which, as you see, is divided up. And in the middle of this is a garrison state called Israel. So that's what we have to work with here. This is a picture of Gaza. Seen from Israel. You see down there in the bottom, there's a fence, a lot of junk, kind of a frontier zone. But just utter squalor. These people are refugees that lost their homes maybe 2 generations ago and have lived here in kind of a temporary existence, waiting for some sort of resolution that has never happened. And by and large, it's gotten much worse.
Is that Gaza? Mm-hmm.
We're looking into Gaza, we're looking into Israel.
No, you're looking at Gaza. That's the total. You're looking from Israel into Gaza. It's a ghetto. You know, it's a ghetto like the Warsaw Ghetto was, you know, in Poland, where the Jews were all herded up and kept in one little secluded part of Warsaw. You know, this is a matter of conscience that we solve this problem. But as I said at the top, we can't solve these problems. A couple of weeks ago here in Houston, I had the extreme honor and pleasure of having a few words of conversation with a NASA astronaut whom you see in this picture, Sunita Williams. There she is down on the bottom row with her hair sticking up in the air because she's not just having a bad hair day, because this picture was taken in zero gravity. She's there with her American and Russian counterparts, and maybe some other nationalities if you see the flags up on the wall behind them. And her heritage, even though she's an American, her heritage is Serbian and Indian, she told us. But we had been talking about this question of the mission to Mars, which I asked her. I said, well, this is so big, but do you think we should just go there as Americans? And she says, no. A project of that magnitude, I believe, says Ms. Williams, that to accomplish this, we will not be going just as Americans or Russians or Chinese or whomever. We're going to go as humans. You know, we're going to find that higher mission for humanity and solve these problems. And so everything that we're talking about today in terms of infrastructure, the water, the rail, the connections between nations, this is not an end in and of itself. It's a platform, as Mr. LaRouche calls it, you know, for where do we want to take civilization and overcome these childhood issues. So let's go forward here now. This is another map of the Eurasia, as we saw a few images back. And, you know, some of these rail links you see have already been constructed. Some are yet to be constructed. Obviously, the ones in Africa are just beginning. But since 2013, when China accepted the proposal that had been put forward by this movement. I mean, Mrs. LaRouche, Helga LaRouche, was at the first land bridge conference in Beijing. There has been an incredible expansion of infrastructure, which is lifting people out of poverty, creating the basis for intercultural dialogue. And of course, here in Houston, a lot of people are thinking about infrastructure these days because, gee whiz, shouldn't we build a few dams and dikes before Harvey hit, you know, rather than just simply sharing the rockets and the Astros and, you know. So anyway, so this is obvious that this is where mankind should go. We overcome these problems and fulfill and find our mission, create our mission for the future. But it's strange to think, but it's ugly and true that there is a class of people in the world that does not want mankind to take that step. And I want you to think back to that picture of the royals, you know, waving on the balcony there, right? Harry and Meghan and so forth. This is an oligarchy that would rather take the whole world down into a flaming ball of fire than surrender its privileged position as they see it in themselves as overlords of mankind. So, but listen, guys, you can't just blame it on the royals. You have to look at yourself. You have to think about your friends and neighbors. And there's a phenomenon. I, with LaRouche, spent a lot of my time out in the field talking to just plain folk. And when I talk about solving the problems of the world, what do we get? There's a phenomenon called Bible prophecy, which induces a sort of fatalism. Yes, 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 yes. You can try to do all these good things, but ultimately it doesn't matter because you see, we're in the end times, don't you know? You see, actually, all the bad things in the world are actually good because famine, disease, war, plague, social unrest, it said in the Bible this was all going to happen. And so this is going to bring Jesus back, right? So adios, you guys. I'm out of here. I'm going to fly and you're going to fry. And
Jesus never left.
and I would say Satan could not have devised a better religion than that if that's what people, where you have this moment pregnant with opportunity in history right now, and yet a large part of our citizens, have been neutralized by this. And so we have to look at this, and that's what I'm going to look at today. Maybe you remember a few years ago, there was a book series called Left Behind by a guy named Tim LaHaye, and it was all about this stuff. So where's it coming from? So so this is Helga LaRouche, who was, of course, a central figure in the bringing Mr. LaRouche's ideas to the world while he was sitting in federal prison. And of course, I'm convinced that the fact that she presented these ideas, not just as an academic proponent of a good economic theory, but as the spouse of someone that had made the sacrifice. Because of course, if LaRouche had plea bargained to avoid going to prison, then there'd be no hope. He would have been broken. Why should anyone believe us? But the power of that people that, after the fall of Berlin Wall and communism, were looking to the United States for freedom and direction and ideas, and were betrayed, then met this courageous lady, Helga LaRouche, and the ideas took root. And so now our task is to bring it home to the U.S. Now, who are these two guys, huh? These guys were sitting next to each other at the Jerusalem embassy being opened, okay? I think, the fellow on the right, of course, is the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, known socially as Bibi. And he will soon be the longest serving prime minister ever in the history of Israel. He's the son of Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the leader of the Likud, who I'll talk about a little bit later, right? And the fellow on the left is the Right Reverend John Hagee, who's based just down the road from us in San Antonio. And any Sunday morning, you can go to his church, and there'll be about 1,000 people there working through the ins and outs of the tribulation and the end times prophecies and where we stand. And of course, this involves ultimately the destruction of most of Israel, because it's going to be the ground for the ultimate war, battle of Armageddon. I think 144,000 Jews are going to convert to Christianity at the last minute and fly out, and along with some Bible-believing Christians, and then Jesus will just fly through the clouds and reign for 1,000 years. And instead of people saying, what can I do to change the world I live in right now? They're trying to figure out where we are in this map of time, and I guess they're kind of assuming that they're going to be on the in crowd. And so if you can have a bubble over these two guys' heads, what would they be thinking, right? The guy on the left would say, well, thank you, Mr. Netanyahu, you for you sacrifice your country for the return of Jesus Christ, right? and Bibi on the right says, you dumb putz, you really believe that stuff? Well, go ahead. Uh-oh, how did that happen, Mike? Okay, so anyway, but look, seriously though, we are talking about matters that are the most sacred and dear to people's hearts. And everyone, even those professing atheists, have a religion of some sort. They have some sort of belief structure. that defines their relationship to the universe and the causality of things. And so, I would like to begin by look a little bit at a section from a letter from the Apostle Paul, which really bears on what we're talking about here today. This is the letter that Paul wrote to the new church in Corinth, which is in modern day Greece. And, he was having to deal with a lot of doctrinaire questions, from, converted Jews, like, do we need to keep circumcising our sons? Do we have to eat kosher? Should I divorce my unbelieving wife? What about the Sabbath? And on and on and on. And he's trying to get to the higher principle of things. And I'm going to, so you've heard this before, but he says, this is Paul, though I speak with the tongues of men and angels and have not charity, I have become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Right? So I'm going to skip ahead. He says, for we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. And I'm glad that in the King James Version, they chose to use the word charity, which is not a perfect translation, but the other translation of this word, which is actually agape, is love. But love is a very much misused word.
Four-letter word.
All you need is love, right? But charity, evokes love for one's compassion, empathy, love, concern for one's fellow man. But consider the ending of this thing when he talks about through a glass darkly. What does that mean? As I understand it, he's saying, look, beyond whatever doctrine you adhere to, right? There is still a higher truth, which we have yet to understand, and we have to discern and discover. And of course, this is in fact a scientific principle, right? The true scientists, Albert Einstein and others, never stop believing in causality, a higher governing principle of the universe, of an evolving and advancing universe. And this is something that, so it's not just a religious question, it's a scientific question. And so, when you're looking at people like John Hagee and so forth, how do you determine the false prophets, right? You have to intuit this question of intention, right? That's what we have to listen to, the intention, the goodwill. We can quibble about the smaller doctrinaire issues, but if the question of intention can move us forward as human beings, then we can solve all the other problems. Now, a couple of other things about St. Paul. Historically, he's quite unique. He was initially a totally devout Jew. He was a Roman citizen. We're told he had a conversion experience directly from God on the road to Damascus in modern day Syria. And it's worth remembering because Damascus has been under assault for 5 years now, but by ISIS, with the connivance of the Obama administration that was arming them. It's still a mess, but largely through the mediation of Vladimir Putin, who was brought in on the invitation of the Syrian government, they're hopeful that ISIS has been crushed, and they begin to move forward. So the image from the tribulation that Russia is a great, evil, army moving in from Magog in the north and so forth. Well, Putin hasn't done that. He's beginning to initiate discussion where there can be a joint removal of U.S. troops and Hezbollah, Iranian troops from Syria as part of a regional settlement, right? So now another note about, but anyway, Damascus, as I said, has a Jewish, Islamic, Christian tradition, all going back, 2,000 years, and then 1,400 years or so for Islamic tradition. And that's what the oligarchy hates. They hate the idea that we're not just animals in a zoo that can be, pitted against each other on ethnic and racial lines. But as my friend Hogg can tell us, Lebanon in its days did exist like that, right?
Yeah, they're living together since forever.
As a secular society, right? But another interesting thing about this picture, where is St. Paul sitting? He's actually sitting in a prison cell in this picture. In fact, this picture was very dear to my friend Mike Billington when he was sitting in prison. And it's the case that when Paul went to Rome, he was detained, first under house arrest. 4 of the epistles in the New Testament were written in prison. One of them called Philemon, about the freeing of a young slave that had converted to Christianity. And then I think within 2 years, the Roman leaders decided to execute him and so forth. So he was an early Christian martyr. But let's look at another jailbird here. Okay. Lyndon LaRouche, right? Who was, here he is, this picture was taken in federal prison. Just for those that don't know, LaRouche was incarcerated on January 27th, 1989, on 1 week to the day after the inauguration of President George H.W. Bush, the man who ushered in the so-called New World Order, which was kicked off on the eve of the first Iraq War. There were actually 2 cases against LaRouche, one in Boston, Massachusetts, and one in Alexandria. The Boston case came to a screeching halt when memos that Oliver North neglected to shred implicated George Bush directly in the vendetta against us. Robert Mueller, who many of you know, of course, have led the vendetta against President Trump, was involved directly in the deployment of a 400-man FBI raid against our headquarters, which I personally witnessed. And so anyway, LaRouche was convicted 1 week before Christmas. The jury, this was in Alexandria, Virginia, not Boston, because the Boston trial against us, the jury declared LaRouche innocent of all charges, but we were cheated out of an acquittal. So they launched a second rapid fire case in Alexandria, Virginia, in the backyard of the government. Everyone wanted to run home for Christmas shopping, so it was lickety split over with in about 10 days. And LaRouche was hustled away with a 15-year sentence on January 27th, 1989. But from behind the prison walls, he saw the fruit of his labors. He saw the Berlin Wall come down. He saw the transformation in China. But of course, he was crippled in his ability to intervene because he was sitting in jail. Helga tried to pick up the slack, Mrs. LaRouche. So what did LaRouche did? Well, he wrote. He actually ran for president, but he also wrote this book. Or this is a collection of works that he wrote in prison. But the last one he wrote is called The Science of Christian Economy. Now, he wasn't saying Christian to the exclusion of other religions, but see, another personality that figured at that moment was the Pope at that time, John Paul II, who was unique in that he had lived under both the Nazis and the communists in Poland, right? And yet, despite having suffered under both of those regimes, he was courageous enough to say that, yes, there were problems with communism, but the alternative to communism is not unbridled Wall Street, London, free enterprise, amoral, marketplace economics. And so LaRouche wrote this book in that kind of charged up climate. What he's talking about is economics, where the source of wealth is the creative spark of the human mind, which we also, in Christian terms, we call that the Holy Spirit. No monkey, can write a symphony or fight a cure for cancer or run a fusion reactor. You have to have a creative spark to make these discoveries, even from day to day. And so I'm going to read just a little excerpt from something else he wrote on this matter. He says, this is the essence of the practical power of Christian civilization, its ability to foster productivity, because mankind in Christian civilization is not a traditionalist in terms of economy. Mankind does not accept being like the brute beast working in the field as his father and his father's fathers before him. Man must use that divine quality which places him in the image of the living God, or the living image of the living God. He must use his reason. His work must flow from reason, not from ox-like repetitive toil, not from the work of a beast. He must innovate constantly, and he must innovate in a way which corresponds to reason, to lessening the imperfections of his work, to increasing the power of his work, and the power in terms of the benefits of mankind. Power in terms of benefits as measured in the development of the minds of his children, and so forth. That drive for progress, so defined as being necessary to the interior of the work of the individual, as rejecting so-called traditionalist forms of labor in favor of technological and scientific progress, has a twofold impact for civilization. And he goes on, but think of the power of what this guy was writing in prison and going out all around the world. So let's talk about prophecy. I want to talk about what it isn't and what it is, because it does exist, of course. And so there are 38 books in the Old Testament. A full 16 of these are designated as prophecy. Let's see if I can move on here. The Old Testament prophets spoke as the voice of God and the voice of conscience to the Jewish or the Hebrew people. It all started, we are told, in Genesis, when God spoke directly to a righteous man called Abram with a unique directive. And I'm going to read this, and this is very important for what follows. So this is Genesis 12. And so this is God talking to Abram. Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house into a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curses thee, and in them shall all families of the earth be blessed. Okay? And so that separated Abram out. Now, scholars say this occurred approximately 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. So that's interesting to think about, because there's about as much distance between us today going back to Christ as there was if you go backward down to Abram. Actually, he became Abraham after this conversation. And all three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, accept this passage of Scripture as part of their heritage. For those in the Jewish faith, Abraham's covenant with God is the beginning of the blood lineage begat by Abraham through his spouse Sarah, which became the Hebrew people. Christians trace their faith back to the Hebrew people as that faith was transformed through the ministry of Jesus Christ. And Muslims also claim Abraham as a spiritual father out of the tradition that the Prophet Muhammad is descended from Abraham's progeny through his second wife, Hagar. And on the west bank of the Jordan, there's a place called Hebron, where there's a shrine which is, we're told, the burial place of Abraham. And this shrine is therefore sacred to all the religions, but of course, since it's on the West Bank, it's more oftenly visited by, the Palestinians. But then we remember this day in 1994 at the mosque, right, where some deranged Jewish fanatic, came in during the prayers and shot up, and killed like 30 people or something in the middle of prayers. So the shrine still exists, but now it's got two doors to it, right? One room in the front and one room in the back, where the Muslims can come in and worship and contemplate from one door, and it's segregated. It's like apartheid. The Jews come in on the other side, right? So it's a tragedy. So anyway, I read you the Bible verse that inspired this beautiful picture. Now let me read you some of the commentary on the scripture verse taken from Cyrus Schofield's Oxford Reference Bible, published by Oxford University Press in 1908. This is a footnote to that verse that you just heard. Quote, God made an unconditional promise of blessings through Abram's seed to the nation of Israel to inherit a specific territory of property forever. Wow. So Jewish religion is no longer about faith and trust and obedience to the one God that reigns above us all. It's actually about real estate. Yes. It's about real estate. And so there's more. The Oxford University Press continued to add revisions to this.
Did that revision take place?
Well, that was 1908, but the Schofield died in 21, but they just add new footnotes every year, right? This is a few years later. God's promises to Abram and his seed certainly did not terminate at Sinai with the giving of the law. Both the Old Testament and New Testament are full of post-Sinaitic promises concerning Israel and the land, which is to be Israel's everlasting possession. But as a specific test of Israel's stewardship of divine truth, the dispensation of the promise was superseded, though not annulled, by the law that was given at Sinai. And then this was added in 1967. Promises to the Gentiles. I will bless them that bless thee. Those who honor Abraham will be blessed, and curse him who curses thee. This was a warning literally fulfilled in the history of Israel's persecution. It has invariably fared ill with he who persecuted the Jew, well with those who protected him. For a nation to commit the sin of anti-Semitism brings inevitable punishment, okay? So anyway, the nation of Israel did not exist, of course, when Abraham had this conversation with God, nor was anything actually called a Jew in existence yet. They equate being Jewish with being tied to the land, the dirt, of that piece of territory on the Eastern Mediterranean. And if you oppose that, you're cursed by God. So the original interpreter of this text is there on the left. His name is Cyrus Schofield. He was a Confederate soldier in the Tennessee militia, veteran ne'er-do-well, a convicted forger, a derelict husband, and a chronic alcohol abuser who was born again and recruited to join the Plymouth Brethren, which was bringing the end times theology to the United States by a British operative named John Nelson Darby, as you see on the right. As you suspect, with all religious manipulation and degradation, all roads lead to London. John Nelson Darby was born in Westminster, London, and christened at St. Margaret's on March 3rd, 1801. He was educated at Westminster School and Trinity College, where he graduated as a classical gold medalist. Darby embraced Christianity during his studies, although there is no evidence that he formally studied theology. he was a lawyer, but then he felt that being a lawyer was inconsistent with his religious belief. He therefore chose ordination as an Anglican clergyman. So anyway, so this was the fellow that that first popularized Darby on the right there, that the message of the Bible is not in the moral prescription that we have to search out God's will and act on his will to be the instrument of his will in improving God's creation. But no, that we're going to peek into the mind of God by figuring out, his designs for the end, which just happens to always seem to correspond with whatever British foreign policy is. So anyway, Schofield on the left spent some of his latter days in Dallas, Texas, where he helped found the Moody Bible College, which is still with us today as the Dallas Theological Seminary. So Schofield's annotated Bible text is the standard reference Bible for thousands and thousands of graduates, which are then disseminated out and preach this through pulpits throughout the nation to the millions of the faithful, right? And so what are we looking at here? Well, here we've got it. We've got it all figured out. So, so just make sure if you're going to go on vacation, you got to wedge it in. But, this is the, there, in terms of the tribulation, the final judgment, and, the signs and so forth and so on. And so there you go. Okay. So, so I guess that, that sea thing, dark pit on the right, that's where all the unfortunate, unbelievers are, but the happy people on the left are they're saved. Okay. So, and of
On
course,
the precipice, however.
Both the blessed and the damned are equally loved by God, though. So
well,
it's kind of hard to figure that one out.
so anyway, let's look a little bit at the prophets themselves, because what are these what is this all about here? Okay. So as we know from history, the offspring of Abraham were driven from their land 3 times. First came the relocation to Egypt through the agency of Joseph to escape a killing famine. This happened around 1600 BC. They found their way back, led by the lawgiver Moses, around 1450 BC. And as a point of reference, that is also about the time of the Trojan War, right, and the Shang dynasty in China. So it's good to remember that there was other stuff going on in terms of the march of civilization. There was an invasion and destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon, which is in modern-day Iraq, in 587 BC. The Hebrews were abducted to Babylon for 60 years as slaves in the Babylonian kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar. And those of you that are in our chorus, every time we sing that beautiful song, Va Pensiero, in the Verdi opera, Nabucco, that's what we're singing about. It was this period of Hebrew slavery in Babylon. And so the question they had was, well, gee, God, I thought we were the chosen people, right? Why are these bad things happening to us, right? Right? And in answer to these perplexing questions, we have the prophets, delivering messages of hope and visions of the future, exhorting the Hebrew people to practice virtue and fidelity to Jehovah. Included in this was the promise of a savior or Messiah, often presented as a valiant military figure to deliver them. And some of this poetry is truly beautiful, right? And give me a second here.
Shall be exalted.
So that's from Handel's Messiah, which we love and enjoy almost every holiday season, right? And a lot of the text of that is taken from the prophet Isaiah, right? And so, but one thing about the texts that you see in the Bible, I don't think any of them were written by these prophets themselves. They were passed on by oral tradition. I think the book of Isaiah, there was at least 3 or 4 authors to it, so they would attribute later writers to to the prophet and maybe jazz it up a little bit, maybe improve it, right? For example, one book that they are always quoting in the end time stuff is Daniel. Now, Daniel was a prophet in the age of Babylon, right? He went in, you've heard about Daniel in the lion's den, Daniel in the furnace, right? And then he had these dreams and visions. And so, Babylon was about 587 BC, but that book was not written until 137 BC, 400 years later. Now, can anybody in this room compose a history of 400 years ago, and particularly since you didn't have telecommunications back then, right? And so this image that they're always talking about in Daniel, well, we have this giant, with a head of gold and a torso of silver and a trunk of bronze and feet of clay, right? And they say, well, this was, wow. Well, of course, he could see in the future was Babylon and then Persia and then Alexander the Great and then Rome. Well, it was written in 137 BC, right? That was 150 years after Alexander the Great had died, right? You were well into the Roman period. So some writers attributing this to Daniel, from 400 years ago. But it's kind of like what Dante did when he wrote the Commedia. He said, he gives, prophesying powers and attributing stuff that's already happened, right? And putting it in the words of an author that walked before. So you need to think about that. And of course, the record is, and I've got some reference books on this, that when these guys projected forward in their forecasts, they weren't so good. But anyway, so the final dispersion of the Jews occurred in 70 AD when Roman legions entered Jerusalem, sacked the city, and destroyed the temple. Most of the Hebrews scattered to the ends of the earth. A few remained behind, but the ones that left were known as the diaspora or the dispersed. And over the time, the area was resettled. But 40 years before the destruction of the temple, Jesus Christ arrived on the stage of history. We won't go through his ministry here, except to say that St. Paul and the early apostles saw in Christ the fulfillment of messianic prophecies, and that kingdom that the prophets had foretold was at hand, and a transformation of the spirit as opposed to a military victories, right? But here you have a picture of Jerusalem burning. You're back at 70 AD. So the enormous temple erected under King Herod had become utterly destroyed. Jesus had reported in the book of Matthew, quote, "Not one stone shall be left upon another." And of course, only 3 years before was the 70 AD was the death of Nero, who had engaged in these brutal, sadistic, tortures of Christians, but also others, non-cooperating Jews, right? So with the destruction of the temple, the, obliteration of the holy city of Jerusalem, the massive torturing and so forth of the Christians, it's certainly easy to believe that some people thought it was the end of the world, right? And it was in this context that you had the book of Revelations was composed about this time, right? And but it wasn't called the Revelations. It was called Apocalypse, and it wasn't written by John either. It was written by somebody else. But someone put that word revelation on there to try to project forward. But we really didn't find that kind of just trying to map revelations on the current events until the British perversion of theology that came in with Darby and Schofield and the like. It was largely, key and code. A lot of it was obviously, you were writing in a police state. You're writing in Rome that was crushing everything. A lot of stuff in that was key and code.
Where is that from?
What? The
The painting.
painting is a painting. It's a painting of the destruction of Jerusalem. I don't know who the painter is. Right. So we're going to move ahead quickly. So the Prophet Muhammad, whose ideas gave life to the religion we call Islam, came along about 500 years later in Central Arabia, where nomadic warrior tribes still practiced an amalgam of animist and idol-worshipping religions. Muhammad's ideas of a life of purity and fidelity to the one God, Allah, they obviously deserve a whole class by themselves. He rejected the Christian idea of the Trinity and saw the historical Jesus as merely a prophet and not of divine origin. Still, his ideas and military victories spread quickly in Southwest Asia, which was stagnating under the rule of the Byzantine Empire, which had co-opted the mantle of Christianity during the reign of the Emperor Constantine. And I'm beginning to read the Quran a little bit, but one point of access, which may surprise some of you, to look at Muhammad is Washington Irving, right? Yes, the same Washington Irving that wrote Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, was part of the cadre after the American Revolution around the Society of Cincinnatus. But he ended up going to Spain. He was actually President Tyler's ambassador to Spain, and he stayed in a place called the Alhambra, which was this beautiful, beautiful Moorish castle, but crumbling, of decayed former glory. And he said, where did this come from, right? And he started looking into the history of Moorish Spain. He wrote 3 books. One was called Tales of the Alhambra. One was called The Conquest of Granada, The Conquest and Fall of Granada, which you see on the right there. And see what it says, the best-selling classic, right? Which treated the fall of Granada as a tragedy, right? Because, after the Spaniards did crush Moorish culture in Spain, and then they went into the Dark Ages of Inquisition Spain. That's when Columbus left and came over here. And then he wrote a book called The Biography of Muhammad, which I also have, and I'm going to be reading. And these were popular books, right? In America, people wanted to drink up this stuff, So anyway, so Muhammad, traveled far and wide throughout the Arabian Peninsula, and then ended up in Jerusalem, where we are told that he was spirited up to heaven from that area right there, where you see the Golden Dome. Yeah, and that is called the Temple Mount, and there's a mosque honoring that today. Now it happens to sit, or we're told that's where it sits, on the same archaeological site as where the former temple of Herod was. So this is a problem. It is absolutely the case of the Darbyites, John Hagee, and they want to get rid of that mosque and rebuild the temple. And there's the Dome of the Rock, yes. And there's a whole branch of British Freemasonry. Where's the word masonry come from, right? It's like building, right? Brick masonry, right? Well, all the ideology is about rebuilding the temple. And there's a British lodge, I think it's called the Quattro Coronati Lodge, under the Duke of Kent, which is all about, being prepared for bringing the temple back and thinking about what hell of religious hatred and so forth that would unleash. Right, there was a rumor that in 1927 that there was some of the Jewish settlers were going to blow up the Temple Mount, and it caused riots and hundreds and hundreds of people killed. So anyway, so this is so moving forward. So coming back now I'm going to develop. I've developed a little bit about the perversion of prophecy, the reality of what the prophets were, but now the pure evil, because see, the British elites promote the prophecy to, say, well, this is what's going to happen. But then, of course, but then they conspire to actually make it happen. And of course, one key element is, well, how are they going to bring the Jews back to Palestine, right? Because what happened is that after the dispersion, after the diaspora, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, scattered all around the ends of the earth, right? And there were always problems. There was mistrust and had a phenomenon, in called pogroms, in Russia and so forth, right? But for centuries, the Jews existed as a scattered but civilizing force dispersed throughout the planet, with many established homes in Russia and Eastern Europe. And one first person that stands out is that fellow you see on the left. That's Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn, who was a true Jewish intellectual, and an author who was read by all of our faction, Beethoven, Schiller, and so forth. And two of his works stand out. Phaedon, where he goes back to Plato, to pre-Christian, and the Phaedon of the Phaedo dialogue about Socrates at his death, drinking the hemlock, talking about the immortality of the soul, and he improves upon it through introducing the ideas of Leibniz. And then a book called Jerusalem, which I think I have here, which is a passionate plea for tolerance. And this opened things up, and so, and particularly in Germany, the Jewish intellectuals really contributed to the enrichment of the classical culture. Here we have a concert featuring maybe by a work by Felix Mendelssohn, who was the grandson of Moses, who gave us such wonderful works, which I hear Marsha playing Song Without Words on the piano every once in a while. But also you had one of the violinists there is Joseph Joachim, famous violinist who was an associate of Brahms. But with the economic reforms of Chancellor Bismarck, modeled on the astounding industrial revolution underway in America, Jews in Germany were enriching the mainstream of Germany's growing industrial and cultural life, while others chose to emigrate to the promised land, the United States of America. That was the promised land, okay? But the empire had other plans. Starting in the mid-19th century, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, Sir Henry Gladstone, and others began to call for a Zionist movement to drive European Jews back to their ancestral homeland as an outpost for British control of their Middle East. One willing recruit was a fellow named Theodor Herzl, who proselytized for his life for a movement which really wasn't very popular, but there he is with a quote, 10 million secret but loyal subjects in all walks of life all over the world, as at a signal, all of them will place themselves at the service of the magnanimous nation that brings long-desired help. England will get 10 million agents for her greatness and influence. So there it was, on the ground floor of the Israel project. But it was difficult. Yes, there was a trickling of Jewish refugees that made it to Palestine during the teens and the 20s. You had a letter from Prime Minister Balfour to Lord Rothschild, so-called Balfour Declaration, winking and approving this action. But what did it take to really open up the floodgates for the immigration? Well, we know what that was, right? And, there was a lot of oohing and eyeing this week. Oh, Meghan Markle, she's an American princess and she's marrying into royalty. Isn't that wonderful? That's never happened before. Well, actually, it did happen before, right? But not quite. And what you see there is Edward VIII, right? Wallace Simpson. Where was Wallace Simpson from, Kevin Pearl?
American actress.
Baltimore.
Baltimore.
Yeah, Baltimore. And their little project called Adolf Hitler, because the fact is the British Empire enthusiastically supported Hitler. They gave cocktail parties for Hitler, as long as Hitler was pointed eastward, because this was written into the ideology of Mein Kampf, right? The brotherhood of the Anglo-Saxon race against the Jews and the dirty Slavs, you know. As long as Hitler was pointed eastward, no problem, right? But then, of course, you know, Hitler did break with the program, you know, signed the Hitler-Stalin Pact, started moving westward. Whoops, right? So, so what we're told is it was a soap opera. Oh, he gave up the throne for the woman he loved, right? No, they kicked him off the throne because there was no way in heck that Franklin Roosevelt was going to work with a Nazi-loving king and Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. So they dumped the king, brought in Winston Churchill and George V, right? But meanwhile, you saw, you know, is that you did have the Holocaust, right? Millions of Jews, were rounded up. You know, it was inhuman, and of course, you know, of course, the misery that was visited upon Germany as part of the Versailles Agreement at the end of World War I. You know, Hitler, you know, channeled people's angers toward the Jews, but you know, how many of your friends, you know, when you face unemployment, you know, misery, blame it on the immigrants, huh? Yeah, they're the reason. Those Mexicans sneaking over the border, you know, they're the reason. Well, why are they doing it? Because, you know, their country have been destroyed by these IMF looting policies. So, but anyway, coming out of the wreckage of World War II, millions of European Jews, traumatized by their experience, feeling betrayed and abandoned by their former neighbors, chose to leave Europe and try to create a new existence in the unfamiliar terrain of Palestine. For much of the leadership, the intention was to create a new city on the hill, living at peace with its neighbors. But again and again, the empire interests intervened to sabotage such a prospect. And one of the most brutal military operatives was that's something called the Irgun, which later morphed into what became the Likud faction, right? Was a fellow named Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was such a ugly racist against the Arab population that the first president of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, called him Vladimir Hitler. So what does he say? I believe in England and the brotherhood between England and Israel. So he led the Irgun until he died in the 1930s. And then he passed, the mantle of leadership was passed on to his secretary, whose name was Ben Zion Netanyahu, right? The father of the current prime minister of Israel, who was the first one actually born in Israel. So I want to remind you, and I'm coming to a close here fairly soon, how Bibi took power, right? Because for 40 years, basically, you had the Labor Party, which was kind of liberal, socially progressive party, trying to hold things together in Israel under difficult circumstances. There were a number of wars. There was the original Liberation War. You had the 6-Day War, the Yom Kippur War. You had a settlement between Egypt and Israel called Camp David under Jimmy Carter. But then while LaRouche was in prison, President Bill Clinton stepped forward to broker an understanding between the Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, who was a hero of the 6-Day War, but understood that he couldn't live in a permanent apartheid situation against the Palestinians, between him and Yasser Arafat, the legitimate leader of the Palestinians in the PLO. And I'll stress the Palestinian PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization, was not a Muslim organization, a secular organization, right? Which had, you know, both Muslims and Christians. And so there you had that, you know, a really auspicious moment, kind of like we saw a month ago when Kim Jong-un and Moon, you know, stepped across that line. So Mr. LaRouche was in prison. He said, you've got to move some dirt. You've got to give some substance to this peace accord. You've got to improve people's lives, you know. We turned the pages of our ER magazine over as a vehicle for Palestinian and other leaders, you know, as to how to make it happen. And we said, don't get the IMF involved. When the IMF got in, they slowed the process down. They attached conditionalities to loans and all this stuff. Nothing happened. Meanwhile, the Likud faction was providing all sorts of support to an outfit called Hamas, which is, is a Muslim counter gang to the PLO. So things were getting, you know, and so you had Hamas being whipped up with, you know, rock throwing operations, and then you had the Likud, the Israeli population, you know, holding demonstrations, calling Rabin a Nazi, calling him a Nazi, but that's what they were doing. And Likud was, and Bibi was leading the charge on a lot of this. So anyway, Rabin, you know, it was 1995. Rabin was continuing to try to go to hold things together. And there was a peace rally at Zion Square one night, and Rabin, for whatever reason, did not wear his bulletproof vest. And a young man named Yigal Amir, a young radical in Netanyahu's Likud faction, shot him down, and that was it. And of course, in name, the Oslo Accords existed, but then you had to have elections, and the heir apparent to Rabin was Shimon Peres, who, unlike Rabin, Peres didn't have much of a military credentials, you know, in his resume. And during that period leading into the election, Hamas was whipped up, you know, with I think a few assassinations and incidents, such that Perez looked like a softie, and people were crying, well, we need a hard liner, you know, and that's how Netanyahu came in, and so there's a lesson to be learned there, you know, on all of this stuff. You know, any move toward peace and accommodation, we've got to begin by transforming the physical economy to improve people's lives, and not let any stinkers from Wall Street or London, you know, say we can't afford it, which is why we need LaRouche's 4 laws. You know, we've talked a lot. Can I have that pamphlet for a second? Sure. Yeah, you just give it. Yeah, I'll give it back to you. Thank you. But, you know, we've just recently put this back into print a second time at no small expense to us, right? LaRouche's 4 laws for economic recovery, campaign for the future, right? And you may think, well, you know, we're talking about Glass-Steagall, we're talking about a Hamiltonian National Bank, right? We're talking about how to create the credit for the infrastructure, and we're talking about a science driver for the future. And, you know, your first response is, yeah, it'll never happen, you know. But think about the hysteria we generated this week with just a little election in Italy, right? Are they freaked out or what? You know, if there's an organized resistance fighting for the right solutions, and as we're attempting to do here in Houston around Keisha Rogers' campaigns, we can move mountains. So anyway, what do we need to do? This is an image from Mr. LaRouche's Oasis plan. You see the date on the top says 1990, but you know, he'd been working on this, and it also paralleled what Shimon Peres was doing back then. He had a plan he called the Israeli Marshall Plan. And you know, one of the plans involves a canal from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea, which would go right by the city of Gaza and turn that into a port city. And it'd be only about 75 miles long. And you see here, it's not seen very well, but there's a couple of floating nuclear power plants there for desalination of water. This is something our former governor, Rick Perry, has been calling for as energy secretary, for example, in the case of Puerto Rico, it would be a very fine idea to have a floating nuclear power plant down there. But it's not happening here under current circumstances. The leader in this kind of technology is actually Russia right now. There's also a plan for a canal from the Dead Sea down to the Red Sea. The Dead Sea's got some of the richest minerals in the world that can be mined. There's plans for hydroponic farming, greening the desert, turning it into the Fertile Crescent again. And under those conditions, of course, these problems will be overcome. I mean, before all this to-do around the embassy, Bibi Netanyahu was facing, prosecution, impeachment, maybe imprisonment on corruption charges. On the right conditions, he could be brought out of there. But it's going to happen through, as I said at the beginning, is bringing that large mass of Eurasia to bear on the situation in Israel-Palestine, and bringing them into this exciting new paradigm of the future, which we're in the process of creating. Here we have one of the dams of China's building a railroad, and look on the bottom there. One thing I neglected to mention, coupled with this launching of the satellite, China announced this week that they're probably going to abandon the one-child per couple policy, or the two-child per couple policy. Why? Because if you're in a zero-go society, children are a burden, right? In the United States, people aren't having kids too much anymore. In fact, a lot of the teenagers are committing suicide, and their parents are dying early of opioids and other things, right? But in a society that's moving forward, children are a blessing, right? And of course, that is the source of wealth, creative human minds. So if they start popping out a lot of babies in China of the creative sort, they will absolutely be the richest nation in the world, right? But as far as the United States is concerned, what's going to happen to us, right? And I'm going to close this in referencing one of the most beautiful pieces of polemic for ecumenical conversation between the religions that was given to us as a gift by Mozart. It's an opera called The Abduction from Seraglio. And the irony at the end of this opera, which everyone should watch, right, is that at the end of it all, the Muslim, through forgiving his enemies who would destroy him, proves himself to be more Christian than the Christians, right? And this is a shocking recognition, on the part of Count Belmont, I think his name is, who's from Spain, of course, probably Inquisition Spain, to recognize that, right? But that was the polemic that Mozart made, right? It is this question of intention, of trying to aggressively do God's will, and so the irony of the current moment, right, is that communist China, but of course it's really Confucian China, through lifting millions of people out of poverty, transforming the deserts, looking into the cosmos, right, is more adhering to the Christian and Bible principle of love thy neighbor than the United States, which, as a dumb dog on a British leash, is mostly generating misery and resentment in the world. So this, all of us, is what we all here must aim to change. And also that includes you, President Trump, if you're listening, okay? So thank you, and I'll take questions. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, I just, that was beautiful. But I wanted to just bring out some of this cultural question from the standpoint of when you talk about the diaspora and the flow from Germany during the early days of Hitler's regime, when it was still possible to leave Germany. And you mentioned the role of Mendelssohn's and so forth. I mean, they were the biggest problem that Hitler had, this high level of culture in Germany and or everywhere where Jews were. And so, there was a trickle of Jews who were allowed to go to Palestine, to Israel. And these people started the orchestra, the symphony orchestra of Israel.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this
Palestine. My mom had relatives went to see them in this conference. Are you talking about that, the little festival?
the orchestra
In Israel.
in Israel.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that people understand the power of culture. The power that culture has to move the hearts of man in a way that includes Jews, Muslims, and Christians. And this is the power that LaRouche movement has. This is why we go through the sacrifices to raise the money for that concert in New York, or whatever we're doing culturally. It's not a side thing of our movement. It is the point of the spear, in terms of moving people's minds to a higher place where they can look down on civilization and their role in it.
Yes, sir.
When you mentioned the Jews in Jerusalem and the descendants of Abraham, you never mentioned the existence of other people living there. There are other nations like the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Adnanites. They were living in side to side with the Jews, and actually they're living more than the Jews, because the Jews, they stayed for a certain period of time, and then they were slaves in Babylon, as you mentioned. They went in the diaspora. But the other nation existed till this moment.
You say today or historically?
No, historically. I speak historically.
No, well, I just say after the dispersion, it was resettled,
No, 3,000 years ago, sir, the people came from Greek called the Philistines, and they are mentioned in the Bible.
Okay.
And they were the Canaanites who came from the Saudi Arabia.
Right.
They were also living there for thousands of years. You just mentioned Jerusalem as if only the Jews were living there. No, there were other nations living there. Even the pharaohs, the pharaohs, were very politically powerful, and they would also have some influence on Palestine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I couldn't cover everything, but people talk about Islam, or because
no, you mentioned as if it's coming from Muhammad Islam. No,
no. I'm just saying that
they were the Canaanites. They are Arabs, and they moved there 3,000 years ago. There were the Philistines who came from Greece, who also 3,000 years ago. They were living there side by side with the Jews.
Yeah, well, most of the Old Testament, the books of Judges and Moab and Gideon and all of this, there's these fights going on, for the territory there. I mean, but of course, since the book was written by the Jews, that's the vantage point that you get, right? That's that one thread of history, but that is true. You had a Phoenician culture just to the north of there.
The Philistines, they are measured in the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah. No, I don't deny that.
Sorry.
I'm trying to address the psychosis that exists. Yes, sir.
I just want to follow your discussion. What's your opinion about American embassy in Jerusalem? Maybe if not only Americans, all other countries will move their embassies in Jerusalem, Jerusalem will have this diversity like Jerusalem have 3,000 years ago. All nations live there, Arabs, Palestinians, and all other old tribes.
Jerusalem under international law is occupied, sir.
No. So right. But what's your opinion? Maybe it will be a good idea if in Jerusalem will be all other embassies from Europe, from Latin America. Maybe it's bring peace in Jerusalem. What's your opinion?
That's what we have to aspire to.
Yeah.
I heard that Paraguay has now moved its embassy to Jerusalem. But as far as this question, you see, there's a big old wall, right? There's a wall that just, snaking through that Netanyahu built, right? Which, and I mean, I agree with you. We need, I think about there's a city up in northeast Texas that my wife and visited when we went. It's called Texarkana, right? You know, it's got one leg in Texas and the other leg in Arkansas, and the post office is split right down the middle, you know. And of course, the people from Texas aren't fighting the people in Arkansas, you know, but you know, Jerusalem could be like that, right? I mean, because they could share it, because it's a source of pride and wonder, you know. And as I've said, nobody's got a monopoly on God, right? I mean, you know, in terms of hi.
Actually, my thing is when you mentioned about time of Russia being friends with, you know, with us, America. Why was there so much emphasis put on the Cold War? And when I came up, you know, we learned that Russia was the enemy.
Yeah.
You got to hide under the desk because the atomic bomb
well,
is going to fall. So how were we supposed to be so tight with them? And then you got Kennedy sitting up here on this wall.
Once
like, what's going on here?
Once
Is
again,
this not a propaganda? Is that
well,
what you're saying?
listen. Thank you so much. Can someone give him a Mueller pamphlet too before he goes? Okay. Think about, you know, World War II. Think about what I said about the British supporting Hitler. You know,
Yeah.
right? The evil we're fighting is the British Empire. Okay, which is based on divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Right, and then controlling everything from the top.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Franklin Roosevelt was an extraordinary individual, right? And he knew he had to come to reckoning with Hitler, but he told Churchill, listen, Churchill, we're not going to be allies against Hitler so you can keep killing people in Africa and India and so forth as you've been doing. So he made Churchill sign on the dotted line, you know, something called the Atlantic Charter, that after the war, the colonies would be let go, they would be allowed to self-determination, and that his idea, Roosevelt, was that American technology would be used to lift these nations out of poverty to a decent future. Well, the Brits didn't want that. And of course, coupled with this is that Roosevelt had organized an airlifting of weapons to Russia. We could not have won the war against Hitler without Russia. People don't think about this. The United States lost 250,000 to the war in the Pacific and the Atlantic. Russia lost 25 million, right? 1,000 times more than we did, including 5 members of Vladimir Putin's family, right? So the British knew that Roosevelt had polio. He was sick. He had congestive heart failure. They were running him ragged with all these summits. They dragged out the war till he died, you know. And then the guy that was stuck on the ticket as his running mate, Harry Truman, was president, who was a Ku Klux Klan supporter, a creep, right? And immediately, in a slobbering Anglophile, he invited Churchill over to Walton, Missouri, his home state, and that was when he made the speech about the Cold War, you know, the Iron Curtain that spread across here. And so instead of an alliance, I mean, it wasn't going to be lovey-dovey with Russia. I mean, there were definitely problems with Stalin, but if we didn't have to spend so darn much on armaments and weapons to deploy that for world development, then there'd be a future for Africa, for India, for the world, right? Instead, you know, under Truman, the FBI was kicked into high gear. You know, they came up with a big list of communists, you know, in the State Department and this and that. You know, my mom was a school teacher back then. You know, she had to sign an oath that you will not or not ever join the Communist Party, right, in order to have a job, right? You could, you know.
Thanks, Joseph McCarthy.
Right.
Yeah.
And Paul Robeson, for gosh sake, he fought that, and look what and where did they kill him? He was effectively lobotomized, in London when he went over there on a concert tour. Yeah, Peter.
I just want to go back to one of the things you started with is that there's a petition on the White House website to get Trump and Putin to have an early meeting. And if you haven't signed that petition yet, you ought to sign it and get all of your friends to sign it, because that is the key. That's the solution to the kind of division you're talking about. Get the United States to work with Russia and China, and we can break the British Empire.
Everyone should absolutely sign it. In the context of everything else we got to do. Mark?
Historical footnote, you mentioned George V and how chummy the British were with the
With who?
with
George
the Axis.
V.
Oh,
George
George.
V, yeah, the British monarch. Mussolini, Benito Mussolini El Duce, was knighted, Knight Grand Cross, Order of the Bath, by George V.
Was it really?
Yes, yeah. He was later stripped of the honor, but this was in 1923 before, but yes, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true that also Hitler was referred to in the literature of the day as a monarchist. All of the Axis countries were to one degree or another monarchists. Yeah, especially Japan, of course, with its divine emperor. So what is the other prominent monarchy, that we know of and unfortunately emulate to this day is the foremost monarchy in the world today is that of the English, of the United Kingdom. No bones about it.
Yeah.
But it's the financial houses.
But
every
once in a while they have these lists, and the richest people in the world. You've got Bill Gates, you've got Elon Musk, there's that guy down in Mexico, the big water guy, right? They never put the queen on the list, right? And yet she's the richest dame in the world, but somehow or other, because she's with the monarchy, it doesn't apply, right? And people see the enemy we fought in the American Revolution, really wasn't the nation of England per se, right? The British East India Company was a private corporation.
Right.
It was a private corporation that was given a license for looting and plundering, by the empire, right? Free enterprise, corporativism, right?
Also known as fascism.
Yeah, also known as fascism.
Yeah.
Who are you, sir? I haven't met you before. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm Wilmer Montalvo. I came here, I think it was
About 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, 2 to 3
Okay.
weeks ago. And I did follow Lyndon LaRouche when I was in college.
Oh, good.
And then I graduated and I lost a little track of how everything was going because I was really busy and stuff. But I'm originally from El Salvador, and we have a group that I talked to Miss Keisha about, and they're actually eager to see if we can get a meeting together with her to talk about certain things about, what's her standpoint on immigration, as far as like not having open borders, because we know that's not going to work. What works is what we're discussing right now, bettering the economies of the countries.
Well, see, I talked about Texarkana. Out there in California, there's a city called Mexicali, right? And then right across the border, there's Calexico, right? But they're really one city. It's the capital of Baja California, and then right on the other side, with a big old wall down the middle, But
and I'm sorry to interrupt you. I read an article on one of the newspapers from El Salvador that said that the U.S. had sent diplomats to El Salvador. The Trump administration had sent diplomats to El Salvador to find or to compose a list of the corrupted politicians that are in El Salvador. And I was like, well, there goes every one of them. But it's a start. And I hope that, Mr. Trump follows through with that, that there is a list that comes up, because we had the last president, he ran off to Nicaragua. He took off with him like $500 million with him.
Wow.
And it's ridiculous. They're running away with the people's money, but yet there is no justice. The country is like the people have already opened their eyes, and they have already realized that if they don't stand for the country, then the country is going to just disappear as it is. So the country is being crippled by criminals, the MS-13 gang. And just like I said, I'm from El Salvador, but not every Salvadoran is a MS-13 gangster, you know? I mean, that's what some people have the idea, you know, that Mr. Trump is referring to every one of us as MS-13. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the gang itself. And I really support him. I back him up, you know, on getting rid of this gang because they're animals. Just like he said, they are animals. And if anyone knows about it, it's me. I mean, I went through it. I grew up in that atmosphere. I came to the States when I was 12, and I saw that. I saw people being dismembered. I saw people, you know, it was just ridiculous. And for Democrats to stand behind a podium and say that they are children of God, that is just, I'm sorry, but it just irritates me. You know, it's really, and if you talk to a Salvadoran about what's going on in El Salvador, they'll tell you straight up. We're realistic. We don't cover things up. We tell you as it is. And you know, that's why it's really good that we have a president who's standing up and who's saying no to the powers up there. And I know that he's got a lot to battle with. And so hopefully, you know, we back him up and stuff and that something is done because Jesus, it's just tremendous amount of work that we have to do.
And to take down the coup that's trying to take down Trump.
Hopefully, you know, everything that they try to find on him, it goes back to them. And thank God.
Yeah, and that's always been the way the enemy is. You know, they put on you what they're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Joe, I was just gonna say excellent discussion because I think also just on what our friend here was just saying, the question of having the type of culture of a true Christian idea of humanity or universal idea of what distinguishes man from animal is what we're talking about right now. And how the question of how to solve the immigration crisis or the crisis of the gangs and the drug operations that's destroying our young people. I have a meeting next week with a lady who's working with teens who right now you have a rapid rate of suicide amongst teens, both drug overdoses, getting involved in these gangs. But the whole point is that the same solutions that could be used for, as you just said, bringing about peace and development in the Middle East right now are the same solutions to what's needed right here in the United States, or what's needed in terms of cooperation with helping to develop these other countries. Because while I agree that we should support the president in stopping gang violence and drug violence, the key to that is that you have to actually give these young people a mission. And, you know, they're going to continue to participate in this type of in these types of endeavors if you just take away something, or you just say, if you have these gangs, you're going to put punishment on them. Well, that needs to happen, but at the same time, what's the solution? What's the solution to stopping the people from blowing themselves up and other people up in Southwest Asia, Middle East right now, which a lot of suicide bombers, that type of thing has been ongoing. But how have we allowed this to manifest? So, I mean, I think the point is there's the solution for it really is what you're discussing right now, this higher idea of the nature of man, which, you know, when I joined this organization and started reading some of LaRouche's writings on, like you said, the science of Christian economy, on the writings on Jesus Christ and civilization, and various other ideas about what true Judeo-Christianity is, man in the living image of God, imago viva Dei, that LaRouche talks about. No other person in the United States or political figure or statesman had ever brought up such a beautiful conception of what it is to truly have this vision of God Christianity or this universal conception of a creator, the creative idea of man. So, I mean, that's what we're talking about right now. What is this idea of the creative idea of man, which I thought you brought out very beautifully. We could have had some, it's the great conductor that Lynn always.
Bert
Bert von
Kruger.
Image.
And we could talk more about what you asked Joanne, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, because Kennedy was always trying to find a way, you know, even around
Even
the
during the
Cuban Missile Crisis and so
Yeah.
forth. He had a back channel with Khrushchev, which wasn't found out until
His
years
brother.
later. But do you know who came in and wanted to insert himself as the mediator, telling Kennedy, you're going to get us all blown up if you don't compromise, you have to surrender your sovereignty to. No, it was Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell. And Kennedy kind of cracked the joke and said, I wish you'd pay a little bit more attention to, you know, what's really going on here rather than your own agenda, right? I'm sorry, I don't need your help. And he worked it out on his own. But that's why the British hated his
With
guts.
his brother,
I
Robert.
love it.
Yeah.
Joe, I wanted to say one more thing on that. Joanne, for you and anybody else that really wants to look into that, there's a wonderful book that's out of print, but it's very much available online. It's called As He Saw It.
Okay.
And it's written by Elliot Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's son, who was with FDR at all the major summits. He was his aide de camp, he was a naval officer.
Okay.
And he wrote the book in 1946 because he said the way the world is developing now and the way my father saw the world after World War II are completely different. And he realized the kind of brawl that was going on between FDR and Winston Churchill, over what would happen next. And, if you think about it, one of the other unique things about Lyndon LaRouche is he's one of the few leaders in the United States who's been willing to defend FDR and his policies. And one of the reasons that FDR was so slandered is because he wanted to have cooperation between Russia and the United States, or the Soviet Union, and the United States to help develop the rest of the world.
Okay. As he saw it.
That book
Okay.
is available
As
as
he
an
saw it.
ebook.
Okay. I gotta write that down.
So it's I always go on to abebooks.com to find cheap used books.
Okay.
If you can't find it, let me know and I'll help.
Okay.
So guys, I'm gonna leave because I have to work tonight, my job. But
Oh, you gotta work.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.